There are perspectives that slip through the cracks of history, not because they were lost, but because no one thought to preserve them. Welcome to Another POV. If these quieter stories speak to you, consider subscribing so you never miss one. The morning comes the way it always does in the south of Italia, gently, without announcement. You become aware of it first through your skin. A faint warmth pressing against the shuttered wood of your window, not yet the full insistence of the sun, but its first suggestion, its soft preliminary arrival. You lie still for a moment longer, in that half-wakened place where the mind holds both sleep and the waking world in equal measure, and you listen. The sounds of Pompeii reach you before the light does. There is the low, rhythmic knock of a baker's boy somewhere on the stone street below, his sandals striking the basalt paving at an even pace, familiar and indifferent. There is the creak of a cart axle, the rough friction of iron on stone, and the dull, heavy clop of a mule whose patience with the morning is older than the city itself. Further off, past the line of apartment buildings that crowd the street on either side like companions leaning in for conversation, you can hear the first voices, not words yet, only the shapeless murmur of people beginning their day, a sound not unlike water finding its course through a familiar channel. You sit up. The plaster above your sleeping space is a faded terracotta, a color that was once vivid and has settled now into something softer, more honest. A small oil lamp on the ledge near the door still holds a thread of flame from the night before, trembling faintly in the draft that moves through the gap beneath the door. The air carries the smell of old lamp oil and the mineral coolness of stone, and beneath that, already beginning to assert itself, the smell of bread. You have lived in this city long enough that you no longer marvel at it. This is how it is with any home. The extraordinary becomes ordinary, the remarkable becomes merely the texture of a day. But this morning, as the shutters swing open and the light falls across the floor in a warm parallelogram, it is worth pausing to see what you have grown too accustomed to seeing. The street below is not wide. The streets of Pompeii rarely are. They were built for people, not for the ambitions of wide thoroughfares, and they carry the density of a city that grew without a master plan, each addition following the logic of need rather than theory. Stepping stones cross the road at intervals, flat-topped, worn smooth by 10,000 crossings, placed high enough that a person may walk from one side to the other without wetting their feet when the street is flushed with water. The gaps between the stones are precisely calculated, wide enough for cartwheels, narrow enough that a careful pedestrian passes without breaking stride. You know already how the day will unfold. The shape of it is as familiar as the smell of the lamp or the weight of your own sandal straps. Pompeii in the year that the city does not yet know will be its last is a city of deep routine, and its routines are not those of monotony but of a people who have organized pleasure and necessity into an art form across many generations. The baths will open later in the morning, and by midday they will be full. The forum will gather its usual congregation of men debating prices, favors, political appointments, the quality of a shipment of garum from the eastern provinces, the reliability of a contractor who has left scaffolding standing against the wall of a temple for longer than anyone considers decent. The thermopolia, those long stone counters with their embedded clay vessels, each holding a different preparation of food, will have been serving customers since before dawn and will continue until the light fails. The city eats standing, eats quickly, eats often, and thinks nothing of it. If you live near the Via dell'Abbondanza, as many do, your morning walk to wherever the day requires will take you past the full theater of street commerce. A man selling honey from stacked amphorae, the jars sealed with cloth and cord. A woman arranging clusters of dried herbs and small bunches of flowers near a doorway. A young man repainting electoral notices on a freshly whitewashed section of wall. There has been an election coming for some time, and the walls of Pompeii are covered in statements of endorsement, declarations of civic virtue, appeals for the votes of neighbors. The writing is practiced but personal, ranging from the formal to the affectionately familiar, and together it reads as a kind of collective conversation that the whole city is having with itself. You pass a fountain at an intersection. This is one of dozens distributed across the city with deliberate care. The water system is a source of civic pride, fed from the hills above and pressured through lead pipes that run beneath the streets. The fountain runs continuously. A woman has stopped beside it with a large clay vessel balanced at her hip, letting it fill with the easy patience of someone who has done this every morning for years. A dog laps water from the edge of the stone basin. The sound of water falling on stone is one of the constant voices of this city, heard in every quarter, taken entirely for granted. The buildings you pass are rarely more than 2 stories. Their lower floors typically serve commerce, workshops, counters, storage rooms that open directly onto the street through wide doorways. The upper floors, accessed by interior stairs or sometimes external wooden steps, are where people live. The walls are thick, built for heat management as much as structural necessity, and they are painted. Almost everything in Pompeii that can be painted is painted. The colors are rich, deep reds, warm yellows, greens drawn from mineral sources, blues that deepen toward the color of a darkening sky. The paintings range from simple geometric patterns to elaborate mythological scenes, from modest decorative borders to full narrative compositions that cover an entire wall. Art in Pompeii is not reserved for the wealthy or the sacred. It is considered a basic feature of a properly finished interior, something that even a modest establishment would not be without. There are approximately 20,000 people living within these walls and the areas immediately beyond them, a number that keeps the city at a particular pitch of density, busy without being overwhelming, intimate enough that familiar faces repeat themselves across the course of a week, populous enough that there is always something new to observe, always a stranger passing through. Pompeii sits on a slight volcanic plateau above the bay, and the land around it is among the most fertile in the region. The farms and vineyards that spread across the countryside beyond the gates produce wine, olive oil, grain, and vegetables of a quality that the city's merchants ship throughout the empire. The region is known for this abundance, and the city's prosperity is built on it. The sea is not far. On a clear day, standing at the right angle along the southern wall, you can see the glint of the bay and beyond it, the gentle curve of the coastline toward Herculaneum, where the streets run closer to the water and the volcanic soil gives even richer yields. The mountain behind the city is a constant feature of every vista, its long sloping profile familiar as a companion, its summit green and seemingly settled in its relationship with the sky. The oldest residents might recall their grandparents speaking of the mountain as a place of some peculiarity, odd terrain near the summit, soil with a strange composition, patches of ground where little grew. But these are old observations, folded into the landscape of memory like stones in a field, noted and then forgotten. The mountain has not troubled this city in anyone's living memory. It is simply the mountain. It marks the horizon to the north, and beneath it the city goes about its considerable business. The Forum is the center of that business, and it is worth going there on any morning to understand the nature of the place. It is a large, open rectangular space, paved in travertine, lined on its long sides by colonnades whose shadows in the early morning still hold the coolness of the night. The temples anchor the northern end, the Capitolium, dedicated to the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, its steps wide and its proportions deliberate, designed to communicate the seriousness of civic and religious obligation in the same breath. To one side stands the Temple of Apollo, its bronze statue emerging from shadow as the sun climbs higher. The market building, the Macellum, occupies the northeast corner, a covered space where meat and fish are sold, where the transactions of daily provision are conducted with a brisk efficiency entirely at odds with the stateliness of the temples nearby. The juxtaposition is entirely characteristic. Pompeii does not separate the sacred from the practical in the way that later centuries might imagine. A shrine occupies a corner of a bakery. A small votive painting of a protective deity hangs above the counter of a workshop. The boundary between civic duty, religious observance, commercial transaction, and personal life is permeable, each bleeding into the others in a way that gives the city its particular density of meaning. The spaces between large monuments belong to people. An old man sits on a low wall with his back to a column, working something with his hands that is too small to identify from across the forum. Two men in the clothing of minor officials stand in close conversation, one gesturing emphatically while the other nods with the expression of someone who has already formed his own opinion but is allowing the performance to continue. A woman moves through the space quickly, her pace suggesting she is headed somewhere specific, her eyes not pausing on any of the surrounding grandeur. By mid-morning, the thermopolia will carry a different quality of light and noise. These are the places where the city feeds itself between its larger preoccupations. The counters, typically L-shaped or linear, their surfaces of polished stone or tile, hold large ceramic vessels set flush into the counter itself, each containing something prepared earlier, a thick legume stew, a sauce heavy with fish and vinegar and sweetness, a preparation of emmer wheat with olives and herbs. You eat standing at the counter, or sometimes on a simple bench if one is available. You drink the wine that comes from the hillside vineyards visible from the city walls, often mixed with water, sometimes with honey or spices added according to preference and season. The transaction is quick and unremarked upon. You have your coins in a small leather pouch, worn on a cord, and the amount required for a basic meal is modest. You could eat here twice a day without it representing a hardship. The cooking smells that drift from these establishments are one of the identifying sensations of the city. Fish sauce, garum, is the base note under everything, the ubiquitous condiment of the Roman world, produced in facilities on the edge of the city that the neighbors of those facilities experience more intensely than most. It has a depth and salinity that is easier to appreciate in its cooked forms than in the raw, and its presence in nearly every prepared dish creates a continuity of flavor that unites the city's cuisine across economic lines. The rich and the modest eat differently, but they often share this particular taste. The wealthier homes, the domus, those inward-facing residences organized around an atrium and a garden, keep their own kitchens and often their own cooks. To walk through the entrance of one of the grander houses is to move through a deliberate sequence of spaces, each designed to communicate status and order. The narrow entrance passage opening onto the open-roofed atrium with its central pool catching rainwater, the rooms arranged symmetrically around that central axis, and beyond, glimpsed through a wide doorway framed in columns, the garden. These gardens are not large by the standards of rural estates, but they are carefully maintained. Roses, rosemary, fig trees, ornamental fountains. They bring light and air into the center of the house, and on warm evenings they serve as the preferred setting for meals taken in the company of guests, a reclining consumption, food carried in by servants, conversation moving from business to philosophy to anecdote with the practiced ease of people accustomed to each other's company. Outside the city walls, in the necropolises that line the main roads, stone tombs record the names of those who came before. Merchants, officials, freedmen, mothers of children, soldiers returned from distant campaigns. The inscriptions are personal and sometimes unexpectedly direct. The dead were placed outside the city not from squeamishness, but from a precise sense of urban order, and their tombs were built to face the road so that the passing living would read their names and for a moment at least remember. Some tombs were elaborate, faced in marble, carved with scenes from the life of the deceased, constructed at the expense of considerable wealth. Others were simple markers, modest in material but still bearing a name, an age, a relationship. This is how the city holds its dead. Carefully, publicly, along the roads. Late afternoon brings a particular quality of golden light to the city that the stonework seems to hold and return. The limestone of the columns, the pumice of the tufa blocks, the brick of the walls, these materials take the warmth of the declining sun and amplify it. And in that hour the city appears lit from within. The shadows lengthen across the forum paving. The thermopolia settle into their evening rhythms, the evening customers different in composition from those of midday. The baths, now in the warmest part of their day, draw those who have finished their working hours and want to ease into whatever the evening holds. The baths deserve their own attention. There are several public complexes in the city, the most elaborate of which offer a sequence of rooms graded by temperature, from the cool frigidarium to the warm tepidarium, to the hot caldarium, where the hypocaust system below the floor circulates heated air through a network of hollow tiles. The floors here, in the hottest rooms, cannot be crossed in bare feet, and patrons wear wooden-soled sandals to protect themselves. The air is dense with moisture, and the smell of the olive oil used for cleaning, rubbed into the skin and then scraped away with a curved metal instrument called a strigil. The business conducted in the baths is not only ablution. It is social. People go to the baths the way people in other times and places might go to a coffee house or a market, to encounter one another, to exchange news and opinion, to cement relationships that are conducted formally elsewhere. The city has learned across its generations to make daily life into something more than maintenance. It is in this elevation of the ordinary into the pleasurable, this refusal to separate necessity from enjoyment, that Pompeii has become what it is, not merely a city, but a way of inhabiting time. What the people of Pompeii cannot know, on any given morning in the autumn of this year, is that the time they are inhabiting is measured, not by the slow erosion of decades, not by the ordinary accumulation of births and deaths and replacements that city life always involves, but by something deeper and more indifferent than any of that, something that has been building its pressure in the dark beneath the mountain for longer than their civilization has existed, that will announce itself without warning, that will not recognize the complexity of the world it finds above it. But that knowledge belongs to what comes later. This morning the fountain runs at the corner of the street. The baker's boy has made his round and returned. The election notices are still wet on the wall. The mountain sits where it always sits, green and vast and quiet. The wine shops open by the 4th hour of the day, though calling them merely wine shops diminishes what they actually are. In Pompeii, the line between a place to drink and a place to live out a portion of your life is not a line at all. It is more of a suggestion, one that most inhabitants choose to ignore. The capone and popine that crowd the ground floors of buildings along the busier streets serve wine. Yes, but they also serve as the social connective tissue of a city that understands something fundamental about human nature, that people need places to gather that are neither home nor the formal civic spaces, places where the rules are relaxed without being entirely absent, where conversation can happen without it meaning anything more than the pleasure of the words themselves. You step into one such establishment mid-morning, not because you are thirsty, but because a man you need to speak with has indicated he will be there. The interior is small. 3 walls are painted with scenes of garden dining, idealized and somewhat faded, the pigment wearing at the edges in a way that gives the images a quality of gentle unreality. The counter faces the street, open to passing traffic, and behind it a man of late middle age with a broad, settled face stands arranging ceramic cups with the unhurried precision of someone who has done this particular act of arrangement every morning for 20 years and has found within it, through repetition, a kind of satisfaction that does not require articulation. The wine he serves comes from amphorae stored in the back, their necks sealed with stoppers, each vessel marked with the producer's name and sometimes a brief notation of the vintage. This is not wine of the kind that wealthy households serve at their formal dinners, selected from a cellar with the gravity appropriate to something that represents both expense and connoisseurship. This is honest wine, the kind grown in the volcanic soil of the hillsides that surround the bay, wine that has absorbed something of the mineral character of the earth it came from and carries it in a slight earthiness at the back of the palate. Mixed with water, and it is always mixed with water, to drink wine unmixed being considered a sign of poor judgment or worse, it is perfectly adequate to the morning, to the conversation, to the city. The man you came to meet arrives a little after you, exchanging a greeting with the proprietor that suggests familiarity without intimacy. The register of people who see each other regularly within a particular context and have arrived at an arrangement of mutual recognition that serves both of them. He sits. He looks tired in the way that people who work with their hands look tired. Not the weariness of sleeplessness, but the accumulated weight of physical days, settled into the lines of the face and the particular heaviness of the shoulders. He works in construction. The city is currently in an extended state of repair, not because it is declining, but because the earthquake 17 years before, a significant tremor that shook the region with enough force to crack walls, tilt columns, and send people from their homes in a state of considerable fear, left damage that has been addressed gradually, building by building, decade by decade, with the patchwork progress typical of large-scale urban repair. Some structures were rebuilt more or less immediately. Others waited for funds or for decisions to be made about whether to restore or redesign. A few buildings still bear the marks of that day in '62, their walls reinforced with fresh brick that does not quite match the older stone, their floors relaid in patterns slightly different from their originals. This means that construction workers in Pompeii have been consistently employed across those 17 years. The scaffolding that the man on the forum observed with mild irritation this morning, still in place, against a section of the temple precinct where work has been ongoing at a pace that suggests institutional patience rather than urgency, is one of dozens of such sites throughout the city. Alongside the work of earthquake repair, there has also been regular new construction, houses expanded, workshops modified, thermopolia added or reconfigured, the amphitheater, the oldest stone amphitheater surviving anywhere in the Roman world, maintained with the care appropriate to an institution that serves as both entertainment and civic identity. The man drinks his wine and speaks without looking at you directly, in the manner of someone whose work requires him to communicate useful information efficiently and without the social ceremony that adds time to conversations. He has been working near the south side of the city for the past several months, he says. The ground there behaves strangely sometimes. He says this not with alarm, but with the measured tone of someone reporting a professional observation. He has noticed it before, this quality of vibration in the earth, small, infrequent, easily overlooked. The older men on his crew dismiss it as normal. The region has always had its tremors. The earthquake 17 years ago was followed by smaller shocks for months afterward, and the general understanding among tradespeople who work close to the ground is that the earth here is simply more alive than elsewhere, that it moves in its own minor ways as a matter of course, and that a man would make himself miserable attending to every small trembling. He does not know what to make of it himself. He finishes his wine, sets the cup down with a small definitive sound, and prepares to return to work. This conversation is ordinary. It would not have been recorded by anyone, would not have been considered worthy of preservation. It takes place in a city full of similar conversations, observations about ground conditions, building materials, the reliability of suppliers, the adequacy of wages, the quality of the season's crops. The material world of Pompeii is attended to constantly, practically, with the focused intelligence of people whose survival and comfort depend on accurate readings of their environment. They are skilled readers of the physical world around them. They know the soil, the weather patterns of the bay, the seasonal behavior of the mountain streams, the quality of the local limestone. What they are not equipped to read, what no one in the ancient world is equipped to read, is the particular language of volcanic warning. The vocabulary for it does not yet exist. The amphitheater, when you pass it later, is empty at this hour, its stone cavea holding a curve of shadow on one side and a wash of light on the other. It seats approximately 20,000 people, a figure that gives some indication of the seriousness with which the city regards its spectacles. The games held here, gladiatorial contests, beast hunts, occasionally public punishments that take on the shape of entertainment, are not marginal events. They are central to civic identity in a way that has no precise equivalent in later centuries, though they share something with the hunger for collective experience, for shared witnessing, for the particular intensity that a large crowd generates simply by gathering together in the presence of something that might not have a predetermined outcome. The gladiatorial contests that Pompeii is known for throughout the region draw visitors from neighboring towns. The fighters themselves live in a barracks adjacent to the theater complex, a structured compound, organized around a courtyard used for training, its rooms austere and functional. Some of these men are slaves. Some are free men who chose the profession for reasons that range from poverty to the particular attraction that a life of organized danger holds for a certain kind of person in every era. Some are condemned criminals given a form of alternative fate. The social and legal complexity of their situation is substantial, and the feelings with which the city regards them are correspondingly ambivalent. Admiration that does not extend to social acceptance, fascination that is careful not to become proximity. There is graffiti about gladiators on the walls of Pompeii the way there is graffiti about almost everything else. The walls of the city are a kind of continuous public commentary, a document written by the whole population across many years, in handwriting that ranges from the careful lettering of someone who learned their alphabet properly to the jagged scratch of someone who had something to say and the minimum of formal preparation to say it. Some of it is electoral, the name of a candidate for aedile, the magistrate responsible for public works and markets, endorsed by his neighbors, his guild, the proprietors of the establishments along his street, occasionally by the city's most popular gladiators, whose public endorsement seems to have carried a real weight. Some of it is amorous, tender, or crude, depending on the writer. Some of it is the kind of personal reckoning that people perform in public when private means are not available, a grievance recorded for whoever passes, a declaration made permanent in painted letters on stone. Among the more than 11,000 inscriptions that will eventually be catalogued from these walls, there is remarkable range. A woman announcing her love in language of some literary aspiration, a traveler recording his arrival and his opinion of a meal, a teacher marking that he has been paid, a man noting, in words precise and devoid of sentimentality, that something has been done to him that he considers unjust. These are not remarkable communications in themselves. They are the kinds of things that people say when they are living their lives. Their value lies in their ordinariness, in the evidence they provide that the interiority of people living in 79 AD is not so different in its preoccupations and its textures from the interiority of people living in any other era. The city accommodates desire as it accommodates everything else, practically within an established infrastructure without significant moral apparatus attached. The brothels of Pompeii are a known feature of the urban landscape, numbered among the establishments that a traveler arriving without local knowledge might locate by following the carved stone markers embedded in the paving of certain streets, pointing directionally, making their meaning clear with an economy of symbol that no one misinterprets. The most substantial of these establishments, the lupanar, A two-story structure near the center of the city contained small rooms on both floors, each with a stone sleeping platform, and the walls painted with images whose purpose is both decorative and instructive, a visual menu of sorts, the figures depicted in postures that leave intentions unmistakable. What the graffiti carved into the walls of this establishment records, names, prices, assessments, declarations, is a document of a kind that later centuries will find simultaneously embarrassing and irreplaceable. It is embarrassing because it is direct. It is irreplaceable because it is honest, because it tells you something about daily human reality that more elevated documents do not, because it confirms that the city knew itself in its full range and did not particularly require its full range to be hidden. This is not to say that Pompeii was without social stratification, without categories of respectability, without the complex moral accounting that any organized society produces. It had all of these things in abundance. The freeborn citizen and the slave occupied entirely different positions in a hierarchy that was absolute in its formal categories, even when daily life blurred its practical edges. The freedman, the former slave who had obtained his liberty, often through the will of his master or through purchasing his own freedom, occupied an intermediate position. His legal status improved, but his social position still marked by his history, a mark that faded across generations as his children and grandchildren moved further from the original circumstance. Wealth could purchase social proximity to classes that birth had placed above you, but it could not entirely dissolve the distinctions, and the city's social life reflects this in its textures. A wealthy freedman might own a house of considerable grandeur, might commission paintings and mosaics of genuine quality, might be a significant figure in the commercial life of the city. He might also find that certain doors, certain conversations, certain relationships remained at a temperature just slightly below warmth, a register of polite distance that communicated what no one was required to say directly. The wealthy elite of Pompeii, the decurions who made up the city council, the established families whose names appeared on public buildings and whose tombs outside the gates were the most elaborate, maintained a social gravity that organized the city around itself without necessarily requiring that it do anything so vulgar as assert this gravity out loud. It was felt in the arrangement of the forum, where the position of buildings communicated hierarchy spatially. It was felt in the size and interiority of houses, where the depth of the garden and the quality of the mosaic floors said what the owner did not need to say personally. It was felt in the social rituals of the morning salutatio, when clients, people bound to a patron by obligations of loyalty and practical dependence, gathered at the houses of important men in the early hours to present themselves, to receive small gifts of food or money, to demonstrate continued allegiance by the simple act of appearing. The patron would receive them in the atrium, moving through the gathered crowd with the unhurried authority of someone who understands that this ritual is one of the primary mechanisms by which the social order reproduces itself, not through force, but through the quiet choreography of presence and acknowledgement. The slaves of Pompeii are everywhere in the evidence left behind and almost entirely absent from the documentary record as subjects rather than objects. They appear in frescoes serving wine or carrying platters, in legal texts as property to be valued, in funerary inscriptions as the recipients of freedom in death, if not always in life. The physical labor that sustains the city, the carrying, the grinding, the cleaning, the building, the constant provision of water and food and fire is largely their labor. The household economy of even a moderately prosperous family is organized around a small group of slaves whose work makes possible the leisure that the family's free members experience as simply the nature of daily life. A slave in a prosperous household might have living conditions that were more physically comfortable than those of a free laborer living in an insula apartment above a busy street. This comparison, which was made in the ancient world itself, is one that requires careful handling. Comfort is not the same as freedom, and the absence of hunger does not cancel the presence of a condition that was absolute in its removal of the most fundamental form of human autonomy. What the enslaved people of Pompeii thought about their situation, how they navigated it internally, what relationship they constructed with the city that owned them, this is mostly silence. The walls speak, but not in their voices. By early afternoon, the city has passed through its first energy and reached a kind of settled working pace. The forum has thinned of its morning congregation. The workshops are in full operation, the felt makers and fullers, whose establishments require considerable quantities of urine as a cleaning agent and whose presence in the city is, therefore, both necessary and not entirely welcome to immediate neighbors. The bakers, whose millstones are turned by donkeys walking in their blind, patient circles. The metalworkers and potters and woodworkers who occupy the ground floors of buildings along the working streets, their doors open to the day, their products visible to passers-by in a continuous display of the city's productive capacity. The smell of the fuller's workshop is distinctive and carries further than the proprietor might wish. The fuller, the laundryman, cleans wool and cloth through a process that involves treading the material in large vats filled with water and the alkaline substance that human urine provides. The workers stand in the vats and work the cloth with their feet, rhythmically, for long periods. It is physically demanding and aromatic work, and the men who do it are a recognized feature of the street, their presence as much a part of the sensory landscape of the city as the bread smell or the fish sauce or the warm stone of sun-heated walls. This is what Pompeii smells like. Bread and fish sauce and animal dung from the animals in the streets and the sulfurous mineral tang that rises, sometimes from the ground in certain places, a detail that the inhabitants attribute to the particular geology of the region, without connecting it to any particular source, without understanding it as a message, without knowing that it has any message to carry. The mountain is still quiet. The afternoon light falls across the forum paving in long, flat plains. A dog sleeps in a doorway pressed against the warm stone. In the garden of a house not far from the Via dell'Abbondanza, a woman is cutting flowers from a climbing rose that has grown up and over a painted garden wall, its blossoms the color of watered blood in the warm light, and she is working with the concentrated attention of someone for whom this task is not a chore, but a small pleasure claimed from the middle of a working day, a moment in which the world requires nothing larger of her than that she attend to what is beautiful and near. The heat of the early afternoon is the city's quietest hour. Not silent. Pompeii is never truly silent, not even in the depths of the night when the carts that are banned from the streets during daylight make their deliveries by torchlight, their wheels loud on the stone in the dark, but quieter than morning, quieter than the evening that is still to come. The sun presses down from a sky that has been the same blue for weeks, the unvarying blue of a Mediterranean autumn that has not yet considered turning, and beneath it the stone of the streets and the walls holds the accumulated warmth of the day's hours and radiates it back at a temperature that discourages ambition. Those who can rest. In the larger houses, the hours after midday are given to a withdrawal from the public rhythm of the city into the private rhythm of the household. The shaded rooms around the garden are cooler than the street by a meaningful degree, the thick walls doing their work, and the sound of the fountain in the garden, if there is a fountain, and in the houses of the Decurion class there usually is, provides a quality of acoustic coolness that works on the body almost as effectively as the temperature itself. People lie on couches in dim rooms, or sit in the garden's filtered shade, or simply close their eyes in a chair for the hour that the afternoon requires of them before life resumes its pace. For those without the luxury of a private garden or a shaded interior, the workers, the shopkeepers, the people whose livelihoods require continuous attendance, the adjustment to the afternoon heat is more pragmatic. An awning pulled further out over a counter, a seat moved into the shadow of a wall, a cup of water drawn from the nearest fountain and held against the back of the neck. The city accommodates the heat because it has always had to accommodate it, and the accommodations are built into the infrastructure of daily life so thoroughly that they require no decision, only habitual response. In the workshop of a bronze caster whose premises occupy the ground floor of a building 2 streets from the Forum, the heat of the afternoon is academic. The furnace required for his work produces a heat of its own that makes the afternoon sun irrelevant as a factor in the experience of the room. He is a man of about 40, compact and precise in his movements, with the particular kind of attentiveness that sustained work with difficult materials over many years produces, an attentiveness that is partly knowledge and partly something more instinctive, a continuous reading of the material in front of him that involves as much sensory information as intellectual calculation. He is working on a commission from a household whose patron wants a small decorative piece for the garden, a figure of a river deity, perhaps, or a satyr in an attitude of mild mischief, the kind of garden sculpture that signals both taste and a certain relaxed relationship to the divine and mythological traditions of Roman culture. The wax model has been prepared over several days with a care that the finished bronze will justify. He works now on the casting mold that will surround the wax, and the work requires patience in a literal sense, a willingness to move slowly, to allow materials to set and cool at their own pace, to resist the entirely human urge to proceed before the conditions for proceeding are correct. This patience is characteristic of the skilled tradespeople of Pompeii in general. The city contains a concentration of craft expertise that reflects both its prosperity and its position in regional trade networks. Pompeii is not a city of grand imperial architecture or government administration. Those functions belong to Rome and to the larger provincial capitals. It is a city of commerce, agriculture, and sophisticated small-scale production, and the people who have built its prosperity are people who know their materials and their markets with an intimacy that requires long preparation and continuous practice. The textile trade is particularly developed. The production of wool cloth, from the raw fleece through the processes of cleaning, and carding and spinning and weaving and finishing, involves multiple specialized workshops whose output feeds a regional market of some significance. The fullers who clean the finished cloth are part of a production chain that runs through half the city's workshops, and the quality of Pompeian wool goods is known beyond the region. The fullery of Stephanus, a large establishment near the Via della Bondanza, processes considerable volume and employs workers whose skill at the treading vats and the finishing tables represents years of accumulated technique. The proprietor is a man of sufficient standing that his name appears in the electoral endorsements on the walls, not as a province on the walls. Not as a person standing that his name appears in the electoral endorsements on the walls. Not as a proprietor is a man of sufficient standing that his name of sufficient standing that his name appears in the electoral endorsements on the walls. Not as a candidate but as an endorser, which is itself a sign of a social position worth deploying on behalf of others. The relationship between trade prosperity and civic participation in Pompeii is direct and unsentimental. Money translates into social position through the mechanisms of public generosity, the funding of games, the construction of public works, the endowment of a guild, the visible sponsorship of civic events that attach the sponsor's name to things the city values. A wealthy freedman who wishes to purchase social proximity to the established elite does it largely through this kind of public generosity, offering what money can purchase in exchange for what birth has withheld. It is a transaction that both parties understand perfectly, and it is conducted with the mutual discretion of people who find it more useful to pretend that money and social acceptance are separate categories than to acknowledge how thoroughly one purchases the other. The guilds, the collegia, are a significant feature of Pompeii's social landscape. There are associations of every kind: bakers and felt makers, fishermen and carpenters, musicians and worshippers of various deities whose collegium provides both religious observance and the social infrastructure of regular meetings, communal meals, the collection of funds for members' funerals, and the general maintenance of a community of people with shared interests in a city large enough that such communities require deliberate construction. Membership in a collegium gives a man, and occasionally a woman, a position within a web of mutual obligation and support that supplements the patron-client relationships of the formal social hierarchy with something more lateral, more chosen, more based in shared identity than in inherited position. The meetings of these associations take place in purpose-built dining rooms, triclinia, that some of the wealthier collegia own outright. Arranged around small courtyards, their walls painted, their floors tiled. The meals held in these rooms are not merely social. They are the occasion for the conduct of collective business, the resolution of disputes, the election of officers, the reading of the association's accounts. They are also the occasion for the kind of eating and drinking that is associated with celebration rather than sustenance, and the records of what was consumed at these gatherings, preserved in inscriptions and graffiti that detail the cost and composition of particular meals, suggest that the Pompeian Collegium took its pleasures seriously. Fish features heavily. The bay provides an abundance of seafood that the city eats in quantities and varieties that reflect both proximity and preference. Mullet, sea bream, eels from the brackish water at the mouth of the Sarno River, shellfish of multiple kinds, sea urchins consumed raw at the water's edge by the people who collect them. The whole spectrum of the Mediterranean's protein laid out in the markets of the Macellum each morning, fresh and priced according to the complexity of the catch. Garum, the fish sauce that appears in nearly every prepared dish, is produced locally as well as imported, and the establishments that produce it are significant industrial operations, their large vats of fermenting fish a presence that the city's poorer neighborhoods in the vicinity of the production sites are far more intimate with than they might prefer. The bread, too, is made in the city itself, in bakeries whose combination of millstone and oven represents a small-scale but complete production chain. The loaves recovered from the ovens of Pompeii, preserved, impossibly, by the same ash that ended the city. Their circular form and scored top, as recognizable as any bread baked in any subsequent century, are round, scored into segments before baking to allow easy breaking. Made from wheat ground by the donkey-powered millstones that occupy one corner of every bakery. The baker rises before the city does. By the time the streets have filled with morning traffic, the bread is already made, the ovens already cooling toward the temperature required for the afternoon's secondary baking. In the garden of one of the larger houses near the Forum, a house whose owner is a man of the Decurion class, his name known in the city as belonging to the kind of person who is consulted on civic matters and whose opinion, while not legally binding, carries the gravitational force of accumulated social capital, the afternoon meal is being prepared with a care appropriate to an occasion of some modest formality. A small dinner this evening, 8 guests, the kind of gathering that occupies a position between private family meal and the more elaborate convivium that requires days of preparation and an investment in ingredients of the kind that is recorded and remembered afterward. The kitchen of this house is a small room adjacent to the garden wall, its ceiling darkened by years of cooking smoke, its shelves carrying the ceramic and bronze vessels an established household. A woman who is enslaved, her name, if anyone thought to record it, did not survive, is grinding spices in a stone mortar. The motion of the pestle rhythmic and practiced, filling the kitchen with a warm, complex smell that moves through the garden and into the shaded room where the host is resting. She grinds the pepper and the cumin together, then adds dried berries of something pungent whose name in her language has no equivalent in the Latin of the household that owns her, whose knowledge of flavor represents a cultivation of attention that no document records, whose labor makes possible the elegance that the dinner will attempt to perform. The garden itself is worth pausing in. Even the gardens of Pompeii's prosperous houses are not large by later standards, but they are used with an intensity of intention that makes their small dimensions irrelevant. Climbing plants cover the rear and side walls, the same volcanic soil that makes the agricultural land around the city so fertile does the same service within the garden walls, and the growth is vigorous and sometimes extravagant. Fruit trees, carefully espaliered, occupy corners. The central space is organized around the ornamental elements: the fountain, the mosaic of the pool, the bronze figure set on its plinth in a position that catches the afternoon light at a particular angle, and around these elements the plantings are arranged with a formality that is nonetheless alive, that breathes and drops petals and changes across the seasons in ways that the fixed geometry of the paths and the plinth cannot. Birds inhabit these gardens in considerable variety. The city is, by the standards of a modern urban environment, extraordinarily hospitable to bird life. The combination of garden plantings, fruit trees, the water of the fountains and the public basins, the food refuse of the streets, and the relative absence of predators above the level of the occasional cat creates conditions under which blackbirds, finches, warblers, and doves move through the city with a familiarity that makes the boundary between human and natural environment nearly invisible. A dove sits on the edge of the garden fountain and drinks with the unhurried confidence of a creature that has determined, through its own accumulated experience of this garden, that the humans who move through it represent no particular threat. The host of the evening's dinner is a man of approximately 50. Whose face carries the particular quality of settled authority that comes from having spent 3 decades navigating a complicated social environment, and emerging from the navigation with his position intact and his relationships largely undamaged. He is not a philosopher or a literary figure. His reading is practical, oriented toward the management of his property, the maintenance of his social obligations, and the occasional engagement with the Stoic tradition that a man of his class and education might be expected to find congenial. He thinks seriously about the question of how to live, though he would not describe what he does as philosophy. He would describe it simply as the attempt to be the kind of man that the occasion, on any given day, requires. He is thinking, this afternoon, about a disagreement with a neighbor over the boundary of a wall. It is the kind of dispute that Pompeii generates constantly, the city's density and its long history of incremental construction producing endless ambiguities of property and access, and the precise location of the line between what belongs to one person and what belongs to another. The legal process for resolving such disputes exists and functions, but it is slow and expensive and tends to leave both parties feeling that they have been somewhat diminished by the experience. The preferred resolution is an arrangement between the parties themselves, brokered through social pressure applied by mutual acquaintances, and the dinner this evening will include one such mutual acquaintance whose presence is not accidental. This is how much of Pompeii's governance actually functions. The formal structures, the magistrates, the council, the legal process provide the architecture within which social life operates, but the actual resolution of most of what matters happens in the margins of that architecture, in conversations at the baths and at dinners and in the colonnades of the forum, through the patient application of relationships that have been maintained across years for precisely this kind of purpose. The city is, at its operational core, a web of people who know each other and owe each other things, and the management of these obligations is the primary civic skill. The sun has shifted enough by late afternoon that the shadow of the house's rear wall has moved across the garden to cover the fountain. The dove has gone. The woman in the kitchen is now attending to a preparation of fish, the cleaned bodies laid out on a ceramic dish beside a mixture of herbs and wine and the inevitable garum, the sauce that will unify the flavors in the way that this cuisine requires. The smell that begins to build in the kitchen and drift into the garden is rich and specific to this time and place, composed of ingredients that are local and seasonal and prepared by hands whose knowledge of them is entirely practical and entirely exact. In the street beyond the garden wall, the city is beginning its afternoon recovery. The worst of the heat has passed. The workshop doors that had been partly closed against the afternoon glare are opening again. The voices are returning to the streets. Somewhere in the direction of the theater complex, someone is practicing on a tibia, the double flute whose sound is the signature instrument of Roman public life, present at religious ceremonies and theatrical performances and funerals alike, a sound that carries through urban stone with remarkable persistence. It is a sound that everyone in Pompeii knows so thoroughly that it has ceased to register as music and become instead a feature of the acoustic environment, like the sound of water or the cry of a vendor. The mountain to the north is lit by the declining sun, its western flank in full gold, its eastern face already moving toward shadow. It looks, in this light, exactly as it has looked every afternoon in the memory of every person currently living in the city below it. It looks, in this light, like something that will always be there. There has been more ground trembling in recent weeks than is perhaps usual, though the characterization of what is usual in this seismically active region is itself uncertain. The people who pay most attention to the ground, the well diggers, the construction workers, the farmers who notice when the water table shifts or when a spring that has flowed reliably for decades suddenly changes its behavior, have remarked on it among themselves without alarm, because the framework within which such observations are made does not include alarm as a calibrated response. It includes instead a pragmatic acknowledgement that the ground here is active and that active ground must be factored into the planning of work, the construction of buildings, the management of infrastructure. Not feared, factored. A well near the southern part of the city has been delivering water with less reliability than it did a season ago. The man responsible for its maintenance has reported this to the household that owns it and has proposed a deepening of the shaft, which he estimates will resolve the issue. The household has agreed in principle, but has not yet committed to a date. These are the kinds of decisions that fill the practical life of the city's property owners, and they are made with the slow, cost-conscious deliberation appropriate to decisions that involve significant labor and disruption. There is no urgency attached to it. The public fountains continue to flow. The aqueduct that feeds the city's water system from the hills above functions normally, its constant pressure pushing water through the lead pipes beneath the streets with a consistency that the city has come to regard as one of the fundamental conditions of civilized life. The evening approaches. The quality of the light changes by degrees, moving from the flat gold of late afternoon into something warmer and more oblique, the shadows lengthening and softening simultaneously. The city reads this shift in the light with the unconscious accuracy of people who live outdoors in a climate that permits it, who have calibrated their days by the sun's position for so long that the adjustment of activity to declining light happens without consultation or decision. The baths in this hour are at their most social. The afternoon crowd has arrived, expanded, and settled into the particular atmosphere of a public space that serves simultaneously as hygiene facility, social club, and the closest thing the city has to a neutral ground, a place where the hierarchies of street and forum are somewhat suspended by the shared vulnerability of undress, by the common experience of hot water and steam, and the practiced hands of the attendants who move through the changing rooms and the exercise yard with the professional attentiveness of people whose income depends on anticipating needs before they are expressed. The exercise yard, the palestra, is still busy. Men of various ages move through routines of ball play and wrestling and the kind of vigorous walking that the afternoon heat earlier made inadvisable. The sound of exertion and competition and the specific masculine sociability of shared physical activity fills the space, bouncing between the colonnaded walls. A young man of perhaps 18 is throwing a ball with a friend whose easy athleticism suggests someone who has spent considerable time in this particular exercise, and the trajectory of the ball between them describes an arc of practiced pleasure, the kind of movement that is enjoyed precisely because it requires a degree of skill that makes careless repetition impossible. The world is going about its evening. The dinner at the house near the Forum will begin in a few hours, when the lamps are lit and the couches have been arranged in the triclinium in the traditional configuration around the central table, and the guests will eat slowly and talk at length and drink wine mixed to a ratio that allows the conversation to remain ambitious without becoming incoherent. The question of the wall will be raised at a moment that feels natural rather than calculated, which is to say at a moment that has been carefully selected to feel natural. The mutual friend will speak. The neighbor will listen. An arrangement will begin to form. And outside, along the streets, the lamps and torches of the evening establishments are beginning to be lit, small flames appearing in doorways and along counters. The city reconfiguring itself for its nighttime face, which is not so different from its daytime face but runs at a slightly different register, a register in which the day's careful calibrations of social position relax by a degree or two, in which the wine flows with somewhat less water added, in which the conversations in the Capone and the Popine extend past the point that strict productivity would sanction, in which the city reveals, in its ordinary human appetites, something close to what it actually is beneath the architecture of its own ambitions. The mountain is dark now against a sky that has gone from gold to a deep saturated blue, and the stars above it are beginning to appear with the unhurried inevitability of stars in a clear southern sky. They are the same stars that have always been there. They are the same mountain. The city below them is the same city that went to sleep last night and will, those within it assume with every confidence that habit can generate, wake tomorrow morning to the sound of sandals on stone and the smell of bread and the fountain running at the corner of the street. The dinner concludes the way good dinners do, not with a decisive ending, but with a gradual thinning, the guests departing in ones and twos over the course of an hour, the conversation losing its collective momentum and breaking into smaller exchanges near the door, the final courtesies exchanged in the lamplight of the entrance passage where the mosaic beneath the feet carries its familiar greeting, and the night air coming in from the street is noticeably cooler than the interior of the house has been all evening. The host stands at the door for a few minutes after the last guest has gone, not because he expects anyone to return, but because the transition from the social density of a dinner to the quiet of an emptied house requires a moment of adjustment, a brief inhabiting of the threshold between the two states. The lamps in the atrium burn low. The sound of the street at this hour is reduced to its essentials. A cart somewhere in the distance, the voices of two men in conversation that carries from around a corner without its words being intelligible, the intermittent bark of a dog that subsides and does not resume. The fountain in the garden behind him continues its sound, indifferent to the hour, the water falling on stone with the same patience it has maintained since morning. The wall dispute has been addressed as he had anticipated. The mutual friend performed his function with the practiced ease of someone who has brokered such arrangements before and understands that the art of it lies in allowing both parties to feel that reason rather than pressure has produced the outcome. The neighbor will adjust the construction. The adjustment will be modest and will be characterized, in the telling of it afterward, as a voluntary gesture of goodwill rather than a concession. This is the correct outcome. The host closes the door and moves through the atrium toward the sleeping room, and the house settles around him into the particular quality of nighttime quiet that thick-walled stone buildings produce, a quiet with some density to it, a quiet that has substance. The city at this hour is not entirely asleep. It never entirely sleeps. The carts that are banned from the streets during daylight hours are now making their rounds, the iron wheels on basalt paving generating a sound that carries further in the night air than it would in the noise of the day. These are the supply carts of the city's economy, wine amphorae being delivered to the caponnet, grain sacks to the bakeries, building materials to the ongoing construction sites that pause their work at dusk but receive their deliveries through the night so that the morning can begin without interruption. The men who drive these carts are accustomed to the hours. They move through the familiar streets with a practiced economy of navigation, their animals equally accustomed, turning at the correct corners without particular instruction. A night watchman pauses at the intersection near the Forum. His role is less enforcement than presence, a signal that the city does not entirely release its attention during the dark hours, that someone is moving through the streets with an awareness of what belongs to the night and what does not. He carries a lamp whose light falls in a small warm circle around his feet and illuminates the paving. Stones with an intimacy that daylight never achieves, making visible the worn smoothness of the stone surface, the grooves cut by cart wheels over decades, the small repairs where a section has been relaid in newer material that has not yet been worn to the same polish as its surroundings. He walks without hurry. The night is clear. The air from the bay carries a faint mineral quality, the salt of the water mixed with something else, something more specific to this particular geography, a trace of sulfur that is so familiar as to register only in its absence on the rare occasions when the wind comes from a direction that does not carry it. He does not notice the sulfur. No one in Pompeii notices it anymore. It is the smell of the place, as much a part of the environment as the stone or the sea air, absorbed into the background of sensory experience so completely that it would require a visitor newly arrived from somewhere without it to remark on it at all. In the barracks adjacent to the theater complex, the gladiators sleep in their small individual rooms around the training courtyard. Their lives follow a rhythm of considerable discipline, the training that occupies the morning hours. The diet managed with attention to the physical requirements of men whose survival depends on the quality of their conditioning. The rest that is not merely personal preference but professional necessity. Some of these men have been fighting in the arena for years. They carry the accumulated evidence of their profession in the particular way they hold themselves, in the density of scar tissue on their forearms and shoulders, and the way their eyes move in a room. A continuous peripheral assessment that training has made automatic and that does not entirely switch off even in sleep. One of them, a man whose name the graffiti of the city has preserved in a kind of rough celebrity, his victories noted on walls in multiple locations, his name attached to the admiration of people who will never speak to him directly, lies awake in the dark of his room. What he is thinking about cannot be known. The interior life of a gladiator in Pompeii is one of the many interiors that the city preserves at its surface but does not reveal in depth. He is a man whose public existence is entirely defined by a single dramatic function, the performance of controlled violence before large crowds, and whose private existence, conducted in the barracks and the training yard and the small social world that these boundaries permit, is as various and unresolved as any other private existence. He is perhaps thinking about a fight that is coming. He is perhaps thinking about something entirely unrelated to fighting. He is perhaps simply awake in the way that people are awake at this hour without particular reason, the mind moving through its own territory without a destination. Outside his window, the mountain against the night sky is a darker shape against the darkness, its outline familiar even in this light, the long asymmetric slope of it a shape that everyone who has grown up in this city carries in some deep register of visual memory, as automatic and unexamined as the awareness of one's own hand. Beneath that mountain, in the hours before dawn, the earth moves. It is not a significant movement, nothing that would wake a sleeping person, nothing that would displace objects on shelves or crack plaster. It is the kind of small vibration that the region produces regularly, that has produced for decades, that the construction workers and farmers and well diggers have noted and factored into their calculations without concern. But it continues for slightly longer than such tremors usually do, and it comes from a direction, or rather a depth, that is not quite the same as the ordinary seismic activity of the region. The ground absorbs it and goes quiet. The night resumes its texture. The morning of the day that will end the city arrives like any other morning. This is the thing that the disaster takes longest to communicate across subsequent centuries, not the catastrophe itself, which is dramatic and total, and in some ways easier to comprehend than what preceded it, but the ordinariness of the arrival. The morning comes as mornings always come. The light increases in the east. The birds begin. The first sounds of the city's working life drift through the streets. The baker is already at work, has been for hours. The fountain runs at the corner of the street. Somewhere in the city, a rooster announces the light with the indiscriminate confidence of roosters, and the sound carries through the still air of early morning with a clarity that will be gone once the day's traffic has filled the streets with its competing noise. The people of Pompeii wake into a day that presents itself as entirely continuous with the days that have preceded it. The sky, when the shutters are opened and the light admitted, is the same blue that has persisted for weeks. The air has the freshness of early morning. The smells of the city, bread, stone, the mineral trace of the water in the pipes, the faint animal presence of the streets are the smells of every morning, and the body reads them as information about a world that is stable and known. By midday, the Colonna has appeared above the mountain. By the time it is visible for what it is, not a strange cloud formation, not an unusual atmospheric effect, but something that has no equivalent in anyone's experience or in any reference available to them. The mountain has already been expressing itself for some time in ways that were individually ambiguous and collectively legible only in retrospect. The small tremors of the preceding weeks, the changing behavior of wells, the springs that altered their flow, the animals, dogs and horses and the mules in the stables at the edge of the city, whose distress in the hours before the eruption will be remembered afterward by those who survive to remember anything, reconfigured in memory as warning that seemed at the time merely puzzling. The column rises. It rises with a speed and to a height that has no precedent in anything the inhabitants of the city have witnessed, and it rises in a shape, the great spreading head above the narrower stem, the form that Pliny the Younger, watching from across the bay, will describe as resembling a stone pine tree that is unlike anything in the visual vocabulary of the region. It is visible across the entire bay. In the harbor at Misenum, Pliny the Elder watches it with the twin attention of a man who is simultaneously an official with responsibilities and a naturalist with an irresistible subject, and the decision he makes to take his fleet across the bay, to approach rather than retreat, to investigate and to help, is a decision that costs him his life and simultaneously gives subsequent centuries their most precise account of what the day contains. In Pompeii, the column is visible above the roofline of the buildings to the north, but the immediate experience of the eruption in the city streets is initially not visual. It is auditory. The sound that accompanies the initial explosion travels through the ground as much as through the air, a compression felt in the chest and the bones before it is registered by the ears as sound, and the ears, when they catch up, receive something without comparison, not thunder, not earthquake, but a sound that has the qualities of both and the character of neither, a sound for which the city has no category and therefore no immediate interpretive response. People stop. This is the first thing. Across the city, in workshops and streets and garden and market, people stop what they are doing and look north, and what they see above the roofline begins the long, terrible process of replacing the familiar world with something unrecognizable. The pumice begins to fall within the hour. It falls lightly at first, so lightly that the initial response of many people is a kind of curious attention rather than fear, the small pale fragments settling on upturned faces and outstretched palms with a gentleness that does not communicate danger. It resembles, to people who have seen such things, A peculiar kind of hail, though the temperature is wrong for hail and the material is wrong and the sky above the mountain is wrong in every way that the sky has ever been. But the body's interpretive habits are powerful and persistent, and they reach for comparison before they reach for alarm, and comparison briefly suggests something manageable. The pumice accumulates. This is the thing that comparison cannot accommodate. Hail stops. This does not stop. The fragments continue to fall with the inexorable patience of precipitation, accumulating on the paving stones and the roof tiles and the ledges of walls and the surfaces of every horizontal thing in the city, building depth by small increments that individually register as nothing and collectively begin, within hours, to represent a serious weight. The roof of a storage building on the edge of the city, weakened by the earthquake repair that was never quite completed, is one of the first to fail. The sound it makes carries through the street below, and the people who hear it begin to move with a different quality of urgency. Some leave immediately. The roads out of the city fill with people who have made the calculation quickly and committed to it. Families moving together, individuals moving faster, some carrying bundles of possessions assembled with the focused prioritization that emergency produces, choosing what is irreplaceable over what is merely valuable, or in some cases choosing what is merely valuable because the mind under extreme stress does not always distinguish between these categories with the clarity that calm reflection would permit. The roads south and east, away from the mountain, become crowded with this exodus, and the movement through the city gates has the compressed urgency of a passage that everyone knows must be completed, but that the gates themselves were never designed to accommodate at this volume. Others shelter in place. This decision is not irrational given what the available information is. The pumice is uncomfortable, and the falling fragments of heavier volcanic rock that arrive among the lighter material are genuinely dangerous, capable of killing a person struck directly. But for those within the protection of a building's walls, the immediate threat is the accumulating weight above rather than the material falling through the air. People gather in the stronger rooms of their houses, in the spaces that feel most solid, pulling doors and shutters against the falling material and waiting with a particular quality of waiting that belongs to situations in which the future is entirely opaque, in which the next hour cannot be imagined because nothing in experience provides a template for what the next hour might contain. A group of people in a house near the Forum have gathered their valuables and moved to the most protected room, and they wait together in the thickening dark. The sky above the city has been obscured by the column's output, the daylight reduced to a yellowish dimness that gives the streets the quality of a late dusk at what should be mid-afternoon. They have lamps. The lamps make a small warm island of the known in the growing strangeness of everything else. One of the women in the group is holding a child, not because the child requires physical support, but because she requires the holding, the confirmation of the child's weight and warmth and breath against her. The child is quiet with the particular quietness of a child who has read the adults and understands that what is happening exceeds the category of things that can be addressed by speech. The bronze caster has closed his workshop and is moving south along the Via del Abbondanza with a speed that his years in the city have given him. He knows the streets as a body knows its own habits, and he moves through the falling pumice and the increasing crowds with an efficiency that a stranger could not replicate. He carries nothing except a small leather pouch of coins that he wears habitually on a cord, and he moves with the focus of someone who has made his decision and committed to it entirely, the decision resolving itself into pure forward motion, the body doing what it knows to do. The fuller's workers have abandoned the treading vats and are moving in a group, 7 of them, along a street that runs parallel to the Via dell'Abbondanza, taking a route that the lead worker knows from years of delivering finished cloth to clients across the city. The pumice is now ankle-deep in places where it has drifted against walls and obstacles, and the walking requires attention. They move in silence, with the economy of physical effort that people under duress discover when words become less useful than motion. In the harbor, the boats that might have offered escape are struggling with conditions that the eruption has created on the water. The sea is agitated, the wind unpredictable, the surface partly obscured by the material falling from the column above. Some boats have managed to leave, carrying people who arrived at the harbor with enough time and enough fortune to secure passage. Others are still there, the crews working to manage their vessels in the difficult conditions, the people on the dock moving with the compressed urgency of those who understand that the window of possibility has already begun to narrow. The gladiator who lay awake in the night is somewhere in the city. What became of him is not known with certainty. What is known is that of the approximately 2,000 people who died in Pompeii, a fraction of the city's population, evidence that the majority did in fact manage to escape in the hours available. The excavations have found individuals in postures and locations that tell partial stories. A man fallen in a street with his hand extended forward, as if reaching for something or someone ahead of him. A family in a cellar, together, the adults having placed themselves between the children and the door. A woman near the city gate with her jewelry on her person and her hand closed around it, fallen so close to escape that the distance between where she is and where she was trying to get cannot be measured in anything as simple as physical space. The house of the man who hosted the dinner is quiet now. The garden fountain runs still. The water system will continue to function for some time yet. The pressure in the pipes indifferent to what is happening above ground, and the sound of it in the empty house is the sound of continuity, of a system operating according to its own logic, unaware that the world for which it was built is in the process of ceasing to exist. The lamps have been extinguished or have burned themselves out. The remains of the evening meal are still on the table in the triclinium, the ceramic dishes, the cups, the residue of the dinner that the household's enslaved workers would have cleared in the morning if the morning had been the kind of morning it had always been before. The mosaic in the entrance passage, the one that carries its greeting in careful tesserae, the figure of the chained dog with the words that tell the visitor to take care, is already partly covered by the material sifting under the door and through the gaps around the shuttered windows. The tessera that form the dog's eye are still visible above the accumulation, looking toward the door with the fixed alertness of a figure that was never alive and therefore cannot register the fact that the world it was made to greet is changing beyond the possibility of recognition. By the time the column begins its collapse, in the early hours of the following morning, the massive weight of the ejecta it has sent into the atmosphere finding the limits of the pressure that sustained it and beginning to fall back toward the earth in the form of pyroclastic surges, superheated flows of gas and ash and fragmented rock moving outward from the mountain at speeds that transform the landscape in the way that water transforms dry ground, instantly and completely. The city has already been changed beyond the life it contained. The flows reach Herculaneum first, and what they do there in seconds ends a city that had stood for centuries. Pompeii receives them somewhat later, the distance of approximately 9 miles buying time that the distance cannot ultimately turn into safety. The people who remain in the city when the surges arrive, those who sheltered and waited, those who were too slow or too encumbered or too committed to the idea that endurance would be rewarded, those who returned after the first exodus thinking that the worst had passed, die quickly. This, if anything about the circumstance can be called merciful, is merciful. The temperature of the flows is such that the body's processes cease before the mind can fully register what is happening. The postures in which people are found, encased eventually in the ash that solidifies around them and preserves the shape of what they were, are the postures of the moment before the end, not postures of extended suffering but of interrupted life, the body caught in the attitude of its last action, whatever that action was. A man covering his face with his cloak. A woman turned slightly, as if at a sound from behind. Two people close together in a space too small for comfort. having found each other in the dark of the final hours and remained. The city, in its ending, holds these postures the way a photograph holds a moment, not the life, but the shape of the life, the outline of what was there in the instant before it was not. The ash settles. The air clears slowly over subsequent days as the eruption exhausts itself. What is left above the surface of the buried city is a changed landscape, the contours of the land altered, the harbor reshaped by material deposited at the river's mouth, the mountain itself changed in its profile by what it has expelled. The survivors who made it out and look back at what was their city see a terrain that does not quite correspond to the terrain they knew, as if the disaster has reached backward into memory and altered even what was fixed there. The silence that follows the eruption is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of subtraction, the particular quality of quiet that belongs to a place from which everything that made it loud has been removed. No cartwheels on basalt. No fountain at the corner of the street. No baker's boy, no mule, no early voice carrying across the rooftops in the still air of morning. The birds that inhabited the garden of the house near the Forum, that moved through the city with the easy familiarity of creatures who had determined it posed no threat, they are gone, displaced to whatever distance instinct drove them in the hours before the end. The sky above what was Pompeii is a sky that has forgotten the city beneath it. It moves with the same indifferent continuity that skies maintain regardless of what occurs below them, and the ash that covers the ground reflects its light back upward without the variety and texture that a living city's surfaces would have provided. The mountain is quieter now, though not entirely still. It continues to express itself in smaller ways for some time, sending up columns of smoke that the people across the bay observe from a distance with the complicated attention of witnesses who are simultaneously grateful for their distance and unable to look away. Pliny the Younger, in Misenum, is among them. He is 17 years old. He has spent the eruption recording it with the systematic attention that his education and temperament make available to him even under conditions of extreme distress, the act of observation and notation providing a structure within which the mind can operate when the alternative is the formlessness of pure fear. His uncle is dead somewhere across the water. He does not yet know this with certainty, but the knowledge is accumulating in him with the weight of things not yet spoken but already understood. His letters, written years later at the request of the historian Tacitus, will become the primary documentary record of what happened. They are remarkable documents, precise, emotionally restrained in the manner of educated Romans who considered the display of feeling a matter of careful management, and yet not without feeling, the emotion present in the selection of detail, in the particular images he chooses to preserve, in the moments where the restraint tightens noticeably around something that the writer is choosing not to say directly. He describes the column above the mountain. He describes the darkness that came across the bay. He describes the behavior of the sea, the earth tremors, the crowds on the shore. He describes his mother urging him to flee and his own refusal, the young man's conviction that dying while recording was preferable to fleeing while ignorant. He describes, in language whose care is itself a kind of memorial, the moment when the cloud came toward them and the world became briefly indistinguishable from its own ending. He survives. His account survives. His uncle's name survives in the term that volcanologists will eventually derive from it, Plinian eruption, the classification given to the specific type of explosive volcanic event in which a sustained column of gas and ejecta reaches the stratosphere before collapsing, the name attaching the catastrophe to the man who described it with sufficient precision that the description became the basis of scientific category. In this way, Pliny the Elder, who went toward the eruption rather than away from it, who died on a beach at Stabia, overcome by the gases that the eruption produced, his body found the following day composed and apparently unmarked, as if he had simply lain down, participates in subsequent scientific understanding from within the disaster that ended him. The survivors of Pompeii make their way to wherever survival takes them. Some go to Naples, some to Rome, some to the smaller towns of the region that were damaged but not destroyed. The Emperor Titus, who has been on the throne for less than 2 months when the eruption occurs, responds with the seriousness of a government that understands the political dimension of disaster as clearly as its human dimension. Resources are mobilized. Commissioners are appointed to oversee relief and reconstruction. The question of what to do with the lost cities, whether to attempt excavation, recovery, rebuilding, is briefly considered and effectively set aside, the scale of the burial making any such effort a project beyond the practical capacities of even an imperial administration. The cities are left to the ash. The people who survived and had homes and businesses and lives in Pompeii carry those lives into new places with a particular kind of dislocation that belongs to those who lose not only what they own, but the context within which owning things made sense. A merchant from Pompeii who sets up again in Naples is not simply a merchant in a new city. He is a man whose professional relationships, whose social network, whose accumulated knowledge of the particular character of a particular market, whose daily habits and the places those habits move through, all of this has been removed along with the city itself. He carries the skills and the capital, if he managed to preserve any capital, but the web of context within which those skills and that capital operated is gone. He must build again, and building again from the beginning is a different enterprise than building for the first time because it is conducted with full knowledge of what building costs and no certainty that what is built will remain. The city beneath the ash is not immediately forgotten. People return. They come back in the weeks and months following the eruption, moving across the altered surface of the buried city, using whatever landmarks remain partially visible, the tops of walls, the upper sections of columns, the edges of roof tiles emerging from the ash to orient themselves in a landscape that was once entirely familiar and is now a map of a place that no longer exists at the level where living occurs. They dig. Some are looking for their own possessions, the things they left behind in the speed of departure. Some are looters, interested in what the buried houses of the prosperous might yield. Some are doing both simultaneously, the distinction between recovery and theft becoming philosophically complicated when the owner of the goods and the city that defined ownership have both been buried under the same ash. They find things. They remove things. The upper levels of the most accessible buildings are partly emptied of their contents by these early incursions, which means that when the proper archaeological excavations begin 16 centuries later, those upper levels yield less than the lower ones. The looters of 79 and 80 AD having done their work with a thoroughness that time preserves as a kind of negative presence in the record, the absences that indicate what was once there and was taken. Then the surface closes over. The ash weathers and consolidates and is colonized by vegetation. And the vegetation thickens across decades into scrubland and eventually into agricultural land, the fertility of the volcanic soil expressing itself in the growth of things whose roots reach down into what was once a street or a garden without knowing what it was. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, the living memory of Pompeii belongs to old people and then to no one. The city that was famous for its production of wine and fish sauce and wool, that was known across the bay for the quality of its gladiatorial spectacles, that covered its walls with the continuous commentary of its own life, settles into the silence of the completely forgotten. It is forgotten for longer than it existed. The formal rediscovery comes in the 18th century when construction work for a royal palace unearths walls and paintings, and objects whose quality and state of preservation indicate immediately that something significant lies beneath the surface. The excavations that follow are, by modern standards, conducted with a mixture of genuine curiosity and considerable destructiveness, The early excavators were interested in objects as treasures to be extracted and displayed rather than as elements of a context whose integrity represented the primary source of meaning. Frescoes were cut from walls. Mosaics were lifted from floors. Objects were removed from the positions that the ash had preserved with a fidelity no human record-keeping could have achieved, and that fidelity, once disrupted, could not be restored. But even the imperfect excavations reveal something extraordinary. The city is there, not destroyed, buried. The walls stand. The paintings remain on the walls. The objects remain in the rooms where they were last placed or dropped. The bread is in the oven. The fish sauce is in the amphora. The electoral notices are on the walls, still announcing candidates for an election that was coming when the mountain interrupted everything. The city is there in a completeness that no other ancient site has preserved, a completeness so unexpected that it takes years for those excavating it to fully understand what they have found. What they have found is not ruins in the conventional sense, the gradual subsidence of a place through neglect and time, the walls lowering by degrees as stone is taken for new buildings and the ground level rises around what remains. What they have found is a city preserved at the moment of its interruption, sealed by the same event that ended it, its surfaces still carrying the texture of a day in progress. The ruts of cartwheels in the paving stones represent not decades of use, but the specific vehicles of specific mornings. The graffiti on the walls is the handwriting of people who stood at those walls with a stylus or a piece of charcoal and wrote what they had to say. The threshold stones worn smooth by foot traffic record the passage of 20,000 people whose lives were lived in the full confidence that the threshold would continue to be crossed, that the wearing of the stone was simply what time did to stone. The plaster casts made from the voids left in the hardened ash by the decomposed bodies of the dead are perhaps the most direct communication across the centuries. Giuseppe Fiorelli, the archaeologist who developed the technique in the mid-19th century, understood that the ash had preserved not the bodies but their shape, the precise volume of a human being in the last moment of their physical existence, held in the hardened material as a negative space waiting. He injected liquid plaster into these voids and allowed it to set, and what emerged was a population of figures whose postures and expressions belong entirely to their specific moment, uncurated by subsequent interpretation, unmediated by the conventions of memorial art. They are not arranged for dignity or for message. They are simply in the positions they were in when the pyroclastic surge ended their movement. A man with his arm across his face, a child curled small, a dog on its side, its collar still visible, its chain attached to the ring in the wall where its owner left it. The dog whose mosaic warned visitors to the house near the Forum, Cave Canum, "Beware of the dog," had its own counterpart somewhere in the city, a real animal tethered while its owners fled or sheltered, its existence ending not in the dramatic way of the human dead, but with the same absolute completeness, the same interruption in the middle of whatever its life was. The mosaic survives. The dog it referenced does not, except as a shape in the ash, a void that records a life without commemorating it. What Pompeii offers, across all the distance of its burial and recovery, is this: the evidence that the texture of daily life in any era is more continuous with the texture of daily life in any other era than the differences of material and custom would suggest. The people who walked the Via dell'Abbondanza and stopped at the Thermopolium for a midday meal and complained about the noise of the cart traffic and argued about property boundaries and fell in love and fell out of love and worried about money and took pleasure in the bathhouse and the garden and the sound of water running over stone. These people were not remote from us in any way that matters. They were engaged in the same fundamental enterprise that every human generation has been engaged in, the project of making a life in the face of everything that makes a life uncertain. The uncertainty they did not know about was the mountain. Every era has its version of the mountain, the thing that appears fixed and familiar in every view. That has been there for as long as anyone can remember. That the eye has long since stopped registering as a threat because its continued presence has been mistaken for its permanence. Every generation builds its city at the foot of something that could, under the right conditions, end it. The Pompeians were not naive or careless. They were human, which is to say, they were skilled at attending to what they could see and less skilled at imagining what they could not. The fountain ran at the corner of the street on the morning of the last day. The bread was in the oven. The walls were covered in the conversations of living people, and the living people were moving through their city with the confidence of those who have organized their world into something habitable and reliable and theirs. The mountain was where it had always been. The sky was the same blue it had been for weeks. This is what it means to live in a city that does not know it is ending. It means living exactly as one always has, with the full weight of routine and desire and small daily pleasure, with the morning sounds and the evening's lamps and the water that runs without ceasing at the corner of every street. It means the world feels permanent right up until the moment it reveals that it is not. The ash that covered Pompeii preserved it more completely than any act of deliberate memory could have done. Every city that has ever existed contains within it the life of its ordinary people, their work and their arguments and their appetites and their handwriting on walls, and almost none of that life survives the ordinary processes of time. Pompeii survived because it was buried. The catastrophe became the archive. The ending became the preservation. And so the city endures, not as it was, not inhabited and loud and fragrant with bread and fish sauce and the mineral trace of its own volcanic soil, but as a presence that refuses to fully recede, that continues to communicate something essential about what it contains. You can stand in what remains of the Via dell'Abbondanza on a morning when the other visitors have not yet arrived and the light is still low and the stone of the street is the same stone that 20,000 people crossed without thinking about crossing it, and what you feel is not the weight of history in its official sense, but something more immediate, the proximity of lives that were simply being lived, the nearness of people who were not performing significance, but merely existing in the full ordinary complexity of existence, right up to the moment when existence was taken from them between one breath and the next. The mountain is still there. It is still watched now, monitored with instruments that would have seemed like magic to the people who lived below it, its every tremor recorded and analyzed by people whose understanding of what it contains and what it is capable of has been built partly on the evidence of what it did. 3 million people live within the range of what a serious eruption would reach. They live there for the same reasons the Pompeians lived there, because the soil is extraordinary, because the bay is beautiful, because the city that grew in that place over centuries has become the context within which their lives make sense, the web of relationship and habit and familiarity that is, for any person in any era, the actual texture of home. This is the perspective that Pompeii finally offers, underneath all its archaeology and its tragedy and its remarkable preservation. Not a lesson about the power of volcanoes, though it is certainly that, and not only a window into Roman daily life, though it is certainly that too. It is a reminder that the ordinary is never merely ordinary, that the morning sounds and the worn thresholds and the handwriting on the wall and the water running at the corner of the street constitute something of irreplaceable value, something that is recognized most clearly, most completely, most painfully in its absence. The bread in the oven, the fountain still running, the dog on the mosaic watching the door. And if these quieter perspectives on the human past stay with you, if the story of ordinary lives and the weight of ordinary days feels like history worth returning to, then you'll feel at home here, at Another POV. If you'd like to keep walking through time this way, you can follow along and come back when you're ready. There is always another perspective waiting.